Well, yeah, I have really... you mentioned the fact that Beethoven had, of course, contact with Haydn, but I'm wondering whether he had any influence on, direct influence, let's say, you know, through contact or teaching of some students and other composers that were to become dominant later in the century.
Well, he had personal knowledge of many of his contemporaries because he was, by 1810, the most celebrated living composer. Haydn dies in 1809, and Beethoven replaces him almost instantly as the world's, quote, great composer. And we just had a Liszt series, of course, and Liszt, as an 11 or 12-year-old child, had been studying with Czerny, who was Beethoven's prize pupil. And Czerny had become the foremost piano teacher in Vienna, and it was, a dream for Liszt, who had already idolized Beethoven, to meet him. And there's this little story, and Liszt will now tell it. I was about 11 years of age when my venerated teacher Czerny took me to Beethoven. He had told the latter about me a long time before, and had begged him to listen to me play sometime. Yet Beethoven had such a repugnance to infant prodigies that he always had violently objected to receiving me. Finally, however, he allowed himself to be persuaded by the indefatigable Czerny, and in the end cried impatiently, "Czerny, in God's name, then bring me the young Turk." It was 10 o'clock in the morning when we entered the two small rooms which Beethoven was then occupying. I somewhat shyly walked in. Czerny amiably encouraged me. "Don't worry." Beethoven was working at a long, narrow table by the window. He looked gloomily at us for a time. A long time, it seemed, and a few brief words to Czerny, and remained silent when my kind teacher beckoned me to the piano. I started and played a short piece by Beethoven's student Ferdinand Ries. When I had finished, Beethoven asked me whether I could play a Bach fugue. I chose the C minor fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier. Again, Matt, that's an interesting thing. Everyone thought that no one knew Bach at that time. And here's Beethoven asking the young Liszt to play. And this is before Mendelssohn had rediscovered the St. Matthew Passion. Let me go on. "And could you also transpose that the fugue into another key?" Beethoven asked me. Fortunately, I was able to do so. After my closing chord, I glanced up. The great master's darkly glowing gaze lay piercingly upon me. Yet suddenly a gentle smile passed over his gloomy features, and Beethoven came quite close to me, stooped down, put his hand on my head, and stroked my hair several times. "A devil of a fellow," he whispered, "a regular young Turk." Suddenly I felt quite brave. "May I play something of yours now, master?" I boldly asked. Beethoven smiled and nodded. I played the first movement of the C major concerto, the first concerto. When I had concluded, Beethoven caught hold of me with both hands, kissed me on the forehead, and said gently, "Go. You are one of the fortunate ones, for you will give joy and happiness to many other people. There is nothing better or finer." Liszt told the proceeding in a tone of deepest emotion, with tears in his eyes, and a warm note of happiness sounded in the simple tale. For a brief space Liszt was silent, and then said, "This event in my life has remained my greatest pride, the palladium of my whole career as an artist. I tell it but very seldom, and only to good friends."
Can I ask you a question? Wasn't Beethoven deaf at that time, totally?
Yes. And this presents a historical problem. The Romantics, I was hoping you wouldn't ask that question. Yes,
well,
that would be 1823.
yeah.
Beethoven was almost totally deaf, and this story disturbs me because of the historical facts. Remember, the Romantics were wonderful in recreating a simple incident into a story with noticed tears in the eyes and so forth. There is no doubt that the story remains in many biographies of Liszt that Beethoven then came to a concert. Czerny had begged him, and in fact he did, there's no doubt about it, and again came on stage and kissed the prodigy.
Now, was that true, or is that...
That is true. So perhaps he was hearing him with an inner ear, or perhaps 1823 that he's not as deaf as other reports have it. It's difficult in reconstructing a biography.
No, he could have actually put his deafness to work for him. It could have been some sort of a shield. And then again, he also could have watched, he could have used it as a defense mechanism, number one.
Well, it's also possible that he did hear, and it wasn't
Partially.
reported, he did hear something, and that he might have used his ear trumpet, which at times he would use very close to the piano.
Mm-hmm. Is it true that he bit the piano to hear people play, or to hear himself play?
Well, sometimes he became violent with physical material, because in his quest to hear, especially when he himself was playing through one of his sonatas, the desperate desire to physically feel the keys and hear the music was always a part of him.
But is that story true, that he would actually just chomp down on a wooden portion of the piano to hear the...
I'm sure it was true, yes, because, I mean, as we have pointed out, Beethoven's violence of character was legendary.
Mm-hmm.
Well, enough talk, and I'm glad you did ask that question, is that story true? Whatever it is, it's a very charming story, and I had to read it. Now, let's hear the complete performance of Opus 10 number 1. We heard all of the different performances on our last program. In this performance, we're hearing a Rao who was not on the comparative performances at all. So, the 1797 work, the C minor sonata, the 5th of Beethoven's 32. A Rao is the artist. Yes, Matt.
Quite an unusual ending to that. In fact, I was expecting 4 movements there. What exactly led Beethoven to go down to 3 movements? And I understand in some of the later sonatas he's down to 2. Did he have a flexible...
I didn't think of that. Opus 2 series, they're all 4 movements. Opus 7 is 4 4 movements, yes. So the 5th sonata, this is your first sonata with a 3-movement plan. I don't know. You know, sometimes it would be a 2-movement plan. Yet somehow it's always right. Opus 111, his last work, and one of the most sublime of all pieces of music, is a 2-movement work. And people thought, well, this is not enough for your last sonata, because he actually said, this is going to be my last piano sonata. However, in the sonata form itself, it's the first movement which is called the sonata allegro form. Sometimes he puts in the scherzo or minuet. In this case, we had it omitted. In the next sonata, Opus 10, number 2 in F major, we also have a 3-movement plan. And the middle movement in F minor, it's marked allegretto, and it's now half minuet and half scherzo, as he's evolving his characteristic scherzo movement. The last movement, he returns to a compact sonata allegro form, and it's not a rondo, as often last movements are, and in future programs we'll explain the history of the sonata idea, which is one of music's great intellectual achievements. But in Opus 10, number 3, the 3rd sonata of this opus, he goes back to the 4-movement plan. Then in the Opus 13, which will be the sonata number 8, the Pathétique, it's a 3-movement plan. And is there a 2-movement sonata? Not for a long time.
But I read somewhere that actually the string quartets and the symphonies are really just sonatas on a larger scale in terms of
the concerto, the string quartet, the symphony. These are the sonata concept in a different media.
So actually he wrote all his symphonies in 4 movements, did he not? Or is the 5th, is there a 5th movement?
There's one symphony that has 5 movements.
That's the last.
And that's the Pastoral.
Oh, the Pastoral has 5.
Yeah.
Which sort of has a program, so actually it's
right.
Perhaps not a true sonata orchestrated.
Well, it's a sonata. Beethoven's main energies are in working in the sonata form, and his second energy is in the variation form. Now let's hear this strange. I call it strange because I believe that this sonata, Opus 10, number 2, is full of so much thematic material that it's very difficult to play, to hold together, and yet it's very effective, and it's not well known. Beethoven, though, was so fond of this sonata that when he repudiated his early music, he still liked this piece. So Opus 10, number 2 is in F major. We have a performance coming up by the late German pianist Wilhelm Bachhaus. Wilhelm Bachhaus playing the first movement of Opus 10 number 2, the sonata in F major, the sixth Beethoven composed for the piano. And Bachhaus, who has been doing very well, just didn't make it at all in this performance. It was just academic is the only word I can think of instantly.
David.
Sorry.
I disagree with you. I mean, up until now, of all the performances I've heard of Beethoven, the sonatas, the early sonatas, I've liked Bachhaus the best, pretty much.
Yes, well, I've liked him very much too, and was surprised. But in this case, you will now hear Schnabel's playing, and
okay.
I think
maybe you can prove it.
You will prefer it. We'll see. Arthur Schnabel playing the first movement of Opus 10 number 2, and that was better. It was tighter. It moved well. I thought that there was certain sloppiness, although I liked that in Schnabel's playing too, because there was no tape editing when he did these in the 30s. Sometimes it's scrambled, sometimes it's technically off, but the spirit is always there. The conception of this sonata was tight. Let's hear... Do you have a question?
No, not really.
Oh, okay. Alfred Brendel. For me, Mr. Alfred Brendel absolutely played that movement wonderfully, and I would choose it any day over the Schnabel or the Bachhaus. And join me tomorrow when we will hear Gilels and other performances of the Opus 10 number 2, and throughout our series of the 32 sonatas of Beethoven. Thank you for listening.
And a reminder that some of these programs, in fact all of them, are rebroadcast in the evenings from 9:05 until 10 o'clock. And tonight you can hear more of the Brahms series.
I think the Brahms waltzes tonight, Leon Fleischer performance, but I'm not sure. But tune in anyway.
WNCN, New York at 104.3. Now the news. The Federal Reserve System and the Treasury Department announced today that the U.S. and 10 other nations will make $5 billion in loans available to financially troubled Britain. The announcement said the loans will be made as standby credits to help stabilize the international monetary system. Meanwhile, U.S. Ambassador to Britain Anne Armstrong made her first visit to Scotland today, and she predicted Britain will surmount its economic problems. Mrs. Armstrong praised the ability of the British people to pull together in times of trouble. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld today the legality of state laws that bar resident aliens from jury duty. The court issued an unsigned order in a case of a Jamaican barred from duty in Maryland. Last week, the court issued 2 rulings on aliens, banning them from Medicare benefits if they have not lived in the U.S. for at least 5 years, and striking down a civil service regulation that barred aliens from federal jobs. Capitol Hill Police posted guards inside the offices of Congressman Wayne Hayes this morning after his staff reported threats. Police say no incidents have occurred. The Ohio Democrat is the target of charges by a former secretary that she was hired on his congressional staff solely to be his mistress. Hayes has acknowledged a relationship with her, but said the woman did government work for her pay. The Senate continues debate on a controversial bill to tighten antitrust laws. With numerous amendments pending, a final vote on the measure is not expected until the middle of the week. House Majority Leader Thomas O'Neill, a Massachusetts Democrat, is expected to announce today that he will seek the position of House Speaker. Carl Albert, Speaker since 1971, said last weekend he will retire at the end of this term. Cuban Premier Castro denies that Cuba played any part in the assassination of President Kennedy. In a Havana broadcast monitored in Miami, Castro said last night Cuba never used terrorism to forward its revolution. In Castro's words, I can categorically affirm that the Cuban Revolution never had the most minor participation in the death of President Kennedy. President Ford says he has serious doubts about whether any other Republican could be elected in November. Ford told a breakfast gathering in Cincinnati the GOP does not want to repeat what he called the tragedy of 1964. In that presidential race, conservative Republican Barry Goldwater was swamped by Democrat Lyndon Johnson. Ford is scheduled to lead a motorcade across Ohio today as the final primary day approaches. Ohio, California, and New Jersey voters go to the polls tomorrow to seek a total of 331 Republican delegates. A new poll of California Democrats shows presidential hopeful Edmund Brown Jr. with a wide lead over his nearest rival, front-runner Jimmy Carter. The polls say 54% favor Brown, 20% favor Carter. Carter, Frank Church, and Morris Udall have stops planned today in Ohio. Brown campaigns in New Jersey. Carter also plans a visit to New Jersey later in the day. In all, 540 Democratic delegates will be selected in the 3 states tomorrow. An earthquake lasting more than a minute shook Mexico City today. Skyscrapers trembled from the force of the tremor. There is no word yet on casualties or damage. Floodwater from the weekend dam burst in southeastern Idaho forced the evacuation today of thousands of downstream residents. The official death toll remains at 6, but officials estimate 135 persons are missing. Breakdowns in telephone systems and road travel hampered efforts of rescue workers. In the words of Idaho Governor Cecil Andrus, it will be an absolute miracle if we get by with a small number of casualties. Andrus toured the cleanup area by helicopter. A power failure on railroad tracks at New York's Penn Station halted all traffic this morning. No trains were able to get in or out of the station for a while. 10 commuter trains carrying an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 passengers were reported stalled in tunnels leading into Penn Station. Bangkok's Oriental Hotel, haunt of the rich and famous, celebrates its 100th anniversary today. One of Asia's oldest hotels, the Oriental has been visited by royalty, business magnates, and authors. Its owners are now adding a 16-floor wing to the Oriental, increasing its capacity to 406 rooms. At 11 a.m., the Dow Jones averages showed 30 industrials at 958.42, down 5.48. Temperature is 63 degrees, humidity 78%, barometer 29.99. The forecast, variable cloudiness this afternoon with a chance of a shower or thunderstorm, the high 75 to 80. Clearing tonight, the low about 60. Sunny and warm tomorrow, high in the 80s. The outlook for Wednesday is fair and warm. Again, the current temperature is 78 degrees. And now music on Entract. We'll hear 4 portraits from The Gambler of Prokofiev, Haydn's Trio in F, music from Strauss's Der Rosenkavalier, a suite, orchestral suite. First, Beethoven's Quintet in E-flat, Opus 16, as performed by the Vienna Philharmonic Wind Group.